To be able to enable that kind of business transformation, I think there is a need from an enterprise or leadership standpoint to drive that change within. And to achieve personalization and things like that, you need systems, data, etc.
I'm thrilled today to have Pratik Kodial, on our show. Pratik has actually a tremendously interesting background. Pratik has just embarked on a second career as a hedge fund manager. But previous, in his prior life, which was about a year ago, and before that, he was a data analytics and e-commerce expert. He formerly, was VP of Marketing Effectiveness at JCPenney and has experience prior to that at Best Buy and many other e-commerce brands. Pratik, welcome to the show, and maybe you can tell listeners a bit more about your background, your new venture, and your past life.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Firstly, thanks a lot for having me here. Yeah, so I've actually made a change in my career. For many people, that may seem like a change, but so I started a hedge fund. But before that, as Jason, you talked about, I was leading the marketing effectiveness team at JCPenney. Before that, I was leading the pricing team at JCPenney, and before that at Best Buy in the pricing and analytics side of the world. Been a consultant long before that. So I've been with retail and consumer goods as a consultant in the analytics, data warehousing, building systems out, more of an architect in the past. So I have done a fair amount of work in the technology space, then moved to the business side, and now eventually in the investing world, which actually is a much longer career for me in the investing side actually than my professional career, but it's a change nevertheless. So looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
That's great. Yeah. So, for listeners, Pratik and I were speaking the other day about what many will consider a very unsexy topic, but really something which is central to the livelihood of anyone, executing against a marketing strategy, and that's the process that makes everything work. How do you take campaigns from data to creative, to deployment across across the right channels, and really what is the process within that drives success? Within that process, Pratik had some very particular thoughts on experiences around how technology enables process. It's our position at Simon that technology is an enabler, but only in the context of the right organization, the right team, and then the right processes within that. There's a flip side to this as well around what process, around what happens when process goes south, and when process evolves to a point independent of a technology strategy, and it just becomes bigger than life itself, and completely unmanageable. And really look forward to covering everything in between with Pratik today. So, Pratik, maybe we can just sort of kick things off around why today, in today's world, a process, an efficient process that drives efficient and enables efficient workflows is more important than ever.
Sure. So let me kind of get started with an overall holistic view, if you will, before we get into kind of marketing operations and the need for process, if you will, and get into the why behind it a little bit in that sense. So within the context of retail, so I'm going to use retail more than anything else, and then marketing after that. But within the context of retail, in my experience, the digital team and the marketing team typically tend to be the early adopters and leaders within the organization from a technology standpoint. That could be for multitudes of reasons, but they tend to be the early adopters, if you will. Now, as we focus into marketing itself in particular, what is the role of marketing in a very, very high simplified view, if you will? They play the role of voice of customer within the organization, right? So they are the voice of the customer across all the interaction channels. And it's not that that's the only team that actually interacts with the customer. It's actually the other teams, if you will, the store, the online channel, etc., and the contact center. But they are generally responsible within the organization to be the voice for the customer. The second piece, if you think about it, is in terms of driving mind share. So what I mean by that is within the consumer or the customer or the audience, if you will, how do you make sure that that particular retailer is top of mind for that consumer or customer in that sense, right? So that's one of the big goals for them, which eventually boils down to driving traffic. So thinking about it, marketing largely leads some of these functions. Obviously, you can kind of divvy it up into much more details, if you will, but these are kind of the big functions there. Now, if you think about all the challenges that exist within the landscape, you've got first the customer. They have changing needs. There's a lot of things changing around them, right? So those things need to be understood and identified and addressed. You've got competition, right? I mean, thinking about retail within the US, probably the most competitive market in the world right now. And so you've got competitors continually trying to advance themselves, innovate, etc. And so you've got competition, you've got customers changing needs, and you've got the macro factors, right? I mean, in our own last 2 years, we've seen COVID, so complete shutdown from a brick and mortar retailer. You go into becoming an online retailer for a period of time, at least in many cases for many retailers. You've now got the inflation situation going on. So there's just a constant change that occurs from a macro standpoint that needs to be accounted for. Now, given kind of the objectives for marketing, voice of customer, driving traffic, driving top of mind mindshare and awareness, this requires marketing to be continually innovating and to be extremely speedy in the ways they operate, right? So that's kind of in the gist of why I think process becomes important, because unless you have a process, it is very hard to actually accommodate to this rapid pace of change that we are all seeing. And retail, again, it's not a spectator sport. We're all in there rolling up our sleeves and getting things done. But that's one of the big reasons in terms of why I think process becomes even more critical, has always been critical, but has gotten even more critical as time goes by.
I was going to say 100%. I guess expanding on a couple of these trends that we've seen over at Simon. Look, when the pandemic first hit, every brick and mortar retail scrambled to go digital. And now we're at a place where the e-commerce trends are back to where they would have been had the pandemic never hit. Yet at the same time, you have this intense digitalization that happened 2 years ago. So you have a landscape, to your point, which is much more competitive than it would have been when the pandemic never hit. And then on top of that, you have all the changes in the consumer dynamic with the recession, potentially, and inflation and beyond. And actually, one thing that I'll add that we're also seeing is marketing budgets getting cut. With that, you have to do more with less. One thing that we've sort of been, one way we've been talking about it rather as a brand is just thinking about, time being the most valuable resource for today's marketer. And ultimately, this is where sort of the details, the devil's in the detail around workflow.
Yeah. So no, it's a great point actually raised, and I do want to touch upon the fact of like the challenges of marketing and the fact that the budgets typically always tend to get cut. Let's call it 4 to 6% of revenues and stuff like that. Well, I'll touch upon that in a minute as I try and answer the process-related question a little bit, right? So coming back to, as you just alluded to, the need to change quickly and consumer preferences, all of that, right? I mean, if we kind of take an example of boiling it down to a few things within marketing, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the marketing operations is a coordination of so many different functions within the enterprise, a lot within marketing, a lot outside of marketing. So I'm going to use a couple of examples here, a little bit on the physical side of the marketing and then digital. So I'm going to use both. If you think about physical on that side or the traditional marketing side, I'm going to talk about direct mail, right? So the things you get on in your mail, or you can do an email marketing campaign. So let's just going to use a campaign. If you think about a campaign and imagine what kind of teams are involved, right? I mean, you've got the whole planning process in terms of when do you want to do it? What do you want to do? How do you want to do it? Why do you want to do it, right? I mean, you may have done something last year, so you want to comp it off or basically do that because it had given some incremental sales, whatever the case may be. So there's a lot of reasons in terms of there's a lot of planning process that happens. We're not going to touch upon that a whole lot in detail and kind of get into the process more in terms of kind of the day-to-day for a marketing team, if you will. If you think about that, right? I mean, if it's your traditional model, so there is a direct mail coming into your house, that process actually starts anywhere between 8 to 12 weeks prior to the actual mail coming to your house. So fairly a lot earlier than what you actually see as a customer. And if it's digital, obviously you can go a little later in that sense. But more importantly, I mean, if you think about the teams that are involved, you've got the merchandising team and the product marketing team coming in saying, what product should I include in that campaign? What should be the price of the campaign? The planning allocation team coming in and saying, do I have the right product availability during that time? This is a lot earlier. I'm talking about 12 weeks prior to the product. Sometimes the product may have been landed in the stores as yet, right? So you're talking about all these different things. You've got the creative team coming in and saying, how should it look like? What should the layout be? The content, the language, all of that type of stuff. You've got the analytics team, hopefully, if it's a forward-thinking organization, to coming and thinking in terms of what products works better with the other one, how do you drive the basket, those type of things. Cross-sell, upsell where possible. And then you've got the audience selection. Who do I even have to send it to? what is my overall strategy, right? I mean, am I attracting, is this a brand campaign? Is it a promotional campaign? Am I getting new customers, existing customers, all of that? So fairly complex set of things that need to be looked into while we think about it. And this is not a one-time process. This happens many times over within a week, every single week for all the 52 weeks that exist in the calendar. And so that's where the process and the marketing operations become extremely critical, because any of these places you drop the ball, two things will occur: bad customer experience, impact on sales and margin, right? Sales. And this is not what the retailer would want to do in that sense. And so operations and process become paramount during this time. And that's why I think the criticality of it. I think the technology piece comes in because technology sometimes enables the adherence to the process and the seamless execution, if you will, and seamless handoff where possible. There is always a caveat there, right? I mean, when you implement new technologies, are you just kind of implementing it the same way as what you did prior and all that? But at the end of the day, from a process perspective, I kind of wanted to touch upon the why it's required and why is it so complex.
Yeah, and maybe Pratik, we've certainly seen examples where we've worked with some large enterprises and then just really had some tremendously complex and legacy processes. I remember one customer had an email sequence that was 58 steps across more than 5 or 6 teams, and no one actually even understood the process to send an email in totality, but everyone understood some part of it. Somehow the whole thing worked at the end of the day, but the pipeline was on the order of a couple of months, and really just a bit of a slog. Maybe we can talk about something that we like to call sort of enterprise process decay, and what that looks like, and how you sort of can identify it.
Absolutely, I think that's a very great point. The reason I say that is I think there is a likelihood of decay or disorder within a process over a period of time, especially for large organizations. But I think I'm going to kind of break that down into people, technology, and process a little bit in that sense, right? And just kind of try and see if I can answer your questions to why does that happen. From a people standpoint, if you think about it, right? I mean, there's constant change, whether there's change from a leadership standpoint, there is change from a people within a particular process or function, if you will, is concerned. So there's always some constant change. And the other aspect is, as there is change within from a people standpoint, the other thing that occurs is if there's leadership change, you have change in direction at times, or if you have people change within the function, though not necessarily a bad thing, they bring in the new, which is what they did elsewhere, and try to marry it with the old, which is what's being done here, right? And so again, I don't see it as a bad thing. It's a positive thing in general. But what occurs in that context is there is usually no function clearly defined with a job responsibility saying, how do you make sure that the overall marketing life cycle is being looked into to make that process integration as seamless as possible, right? So again, everyone's doing things with the right intent, or at least that's what I believe. And so everyone's trying to optimize within their own function, if you will. But that may not necessarily, that's their role, if you will. But since they don't have the overarching role, or there's no one necessarily kind of having an overarching role, there may be a project manager, but they kind of are held accountable to get things done, not necessarily help the process improve all the time over time. I think that's one challenge, right? So you've got the people side of the world. I'm going to touch on technology a little bit as well before I get into the process. So now if you think about the technology, again, I've worked with so many retailers, and there's a varying degree of technology debt across each retailer based on their history, if you will. But there's always some tech debt in terms of quick fixes that they've done in their past, new technology living with the old, the fact that they have retiring systems that they need to retire that they don't retire, either because of the cost involved in retiring an old technology or system, or the fact that people are married to those systems or processes that they don't want to give it up. So there are multitudes of reasons why technology platforms stay the way they are within the marketing organizations, or a mix of old and new. What that does, though, is it creates issues for the teams that are working through it, because it just makes it extremely cumbersome, especially for the person who's new to the organization. They probably come in and just get shocked with the complexity involved in getting things done. And they start obviously marrying old with the new, and you start including more and more steps. To your point, I think you mentioned 58 steps in an email process, things like that. And so it just continues to add up, right? Again, everyone working with the right intent. And then you kind of get into the process, and that's where you kind of find out at the end of the day, if someone comes from the outside and says, what's going on? And explain to me how this email process works. The first thing is you usually don't find any, right? Because each person knows their own siloed piece of work. And usually there's a need of a consultant, someone from the outside or inside if they've been given the responsibility to start documenting it, just to the shock of leaders and everyone else within marketing saying this is all that they have to do. Like a 58-step process to get an email out.
Yeah, no, 100%. And Pratik, maybe we can talk about, so the flip side, sort of transition a little bit and talk about the flip side of good process and how technology can enable that. And obviously, one of the biggest challenges around data complexities. And look, with this 58-step email process, were many steps in pulling data from legacy systems, from the likes of Unica, from on-prem databases, all sorts of governance steps, and things that are, were really just sort of nitty-gritty compliance issues that had to deal with, where data came from, how it's being used, how it's being pulled, how it's being operationalized, how it's being QA'd. And so maybe we can talk about how technology rather can aid good process, and how data, how technology that enables streamlined data access and enablement is more critical today than ever.
Yeah. Let me kind of try and break this out into 3 sections, if you will. I'm going to call it business transformation. I'm going to talk about the analytics space, and then you touched upon the data quality and so on. So I'm going to kind of call it customer identification. I'll define what each one of it is. And I'll kind of talk about why, and this is a journey that we took at, when I was at Best Buy. This is some work that we did in 2012, 2013. Won't get into too much specifics, but at a high level, I'll talk about each one of them. Let me touch on business transformation first, right? If you think about business transformation, and we need to do that continually, right? I mean, because of the changing landscape and so on. If you think about business transformation, of late, what people are talking about, one-to-one marketing, personalization, et cetera, then improving marketing return on spend, given that it's a big spend from a sales, from an overall organization standpoint. To be able to enable that kind of business transformation, I think there is a need from an enterprise or leadership standpoint to drive that change within. And to achieve personalization and things like that, you need systems, data, etc. And that is a journey, in my opinion. It never ends, right? I mean, that's one thing, and I don't know what you think about it on the other side. So as I was working on kind of on the business side, I would always think about it and look at suspicion if a vendor is coming to me and saying that if you do this, it's done, right? I mean, I never think about it that way. In my opinion, it's always a journey because there are new data sources that are always coming in. Back in early 2000s, people never really looked at unstructured data. Now it's a commonality, right? I mean, so things continually change.
I was going to say, with this, Scott Brinker actually, HubSpot, ecosystem analyst has had a piece today, and this is, I guess, we're recording this on August 30th, but really just talking about the evolution of MarTech from a cloud to sort of an ecosystem and platform play. And I think that certainly does reflect larger trends, to your point, around not having to choose A or B, but asking, hey, I'll actually be able to do both, and they'll be able to work together holistically. So certainly I think there is a bit of a transition happening there in the market, to your point.
Exactly. So coming back to kind of the importance and need, of data and so on, right? I mean, you've got the customer. So I've talked about business transformation, the need to do it. Eventually, obviously, the reason for it is improved customer retention, loyalty, and revenues, and so on and so forth. But how do you achieve that kind of business transformation? The only way to do that, or one of the best ways, in my opinion, to do that is to drive that through deep analytics, right? And improve processes, if you will, but deep analytics in that sense. And that's where you've got the whole analytics infrastructure that comes into place. Technologies have changed, so the names of it have changed over time. But I think the integration and seamless play of structured, unstructured data, transactional, interaction information, search information, survey information. There's just so many data sources that are available to make a better decision, if you will. And so that's the other piece that I think data plays a big part in enabling some of that business transformation. And the third, and actually where it starts from, in my opinion, is the whole customer identification piece. This is where I've seen retailers not focusing so much on, or at least that's been my experience. I think that's why I did a fantastic job. But in general, I see retailers not focusing. They always have a system in place, but I don't know if enough time is spent on that front. And what I mean by that is customers are interacting through so many means today, right? They call you on the contact through the contact center. They search for product on your website, or they search on Google, or they actually make a transaction online, in store, or through some other mechanism. Generally speaking, most of the time and energy goes through the transaction systems. A lot of less energy in kind of the interaction places, right? I mean, think about most retailers typically have a conversion of 4% or less online. So you have 96 of every 100 customers dropping off, approximately, or even more. And some of them are repeat and things like that. So I get it. But what I'm saying here is how do you improve the identification of the customer across every interaction channel they have, regardless of whether that's a transaction or not, and improving that data quality there? Because the better you are at that, the more improved loyalty over time you will have, because they're not calling a contact center and having to explain everything they did 2 hours earlier in a store.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's actually one of the more poorly understood aspects of actually executing as an omnichannel strategy. Everyone understands, targeting via ads or on-site or direct mail or the delivery channels.
Yes.
But thinking about the data, considerations around the channel strategy is equally as important. And that includes both having strong data capabilities to, relate your digital identities to your offline identities, but also having a strategy beyond that to try to get users to log in or to email capture, to really think, hey, how do I actually understand that this is an anonymous customer, but they're actually a known customer. You look at a web property like JCPenney, JCPenney, massive reach, massive customer list, but well over 50% of traffic is going to be anonymous. That doesn't mean that over 50% of traffic has never purchased on JCPenney before. You just can't make the linkage.
Exactly.
And to the extent that you can make that linkage, translates to better data, translates the ability to to bridge your recent browse behavior with historical transaction data,
exactly.
and it allows to personalize and then to execute across your omni-channel delivery strategy.
Exactly. No, totally agree with what you're saying. Yes. I mean, I'll just add a few other things here as well, if that's okay. I mean, one of the things that I've always, having interacted with CXO, CEOs, etc., across many retailers, I mean, I always see them as very analytical, data-driven. I have not heard of any senior executive saying that they are not data-driven or analytical. I think the challenge comes in terms of, like, why doesn't it percolate down within the organization? I'm trying to kind of come back to the question you asked around the importance of data and things like that. So I kind of taking a two-pronged approach, if you will. One is like, why is it important? What things need to be done? But I think there's a fundamental question that needs to be answered, which I think only the executives and senior individuals within the company can, right? I mean, again, so everyone, or the senior execs, as they said, are all suggest that they're data savvy, analytical, so on and so forth. But if you think about the incentive structure within the organization, sometimes that is not right. And I'll try and explain what I mean by that, right? I mean, again, the bread and butter for a retailer, in my opinion, in fact, for all companies, is you've got to grow revenues over time. It's hard for one to be successful if you're not growing revenues, and that, in my opinion, applies for everyone. But let's talk about retail in this context, right? So you grow revenues and you grow profitability over time. It's very hard to have declining revenues and growing profit. You can do it, but that usually happens for some period. Why am I explaining that here? I want to go back to the incentive structure. And the reason I say that is that the incentive structure is largely driven by profitability only and not by growing revenues. That could drive the organization to move in a very different direction. So let's say the organization is having challenges growing revenues, and so you have your incentive structure largely driven by profitability. Now comes marketing spend. Let's say marketing spend typically for retail is anywhere between 4% to 6%. Usually most retailers will be in that space of revenues, 4 to 6% of revenues. It's a big chunk, right? So after your labor spend in store, if you're a brick and mortar retailer, if you're a large online retailer, your distribution, shipping spend, marketing becomes a large spend. To improve profitability in a declining revenue, that's a big bucket that people look into to reduce spend, right? I mean, I think most people have optimized stores as much as they could. They probably do it again, but they probably optimize. So marketing spend tends to be that bucket, an easy one to look into, in my opinion. And that's what creates a lot of pressure to either reduce the spend by reducing your marketing efforts or reducing the people involved in marketing, right? Usually the spend in marketing efforts. And this is kind of creates a snowball effect, lesser marketing spend, lesser customers potentially, lesser brand marketing that you do, and so on and so forth. And I think that's another challenge I think senior executives need to think about. And it's a very hard one to solve. It's not that they're not thinking about it. It's just a very hard one to solve. But somewhere down the line, I think deeper thought has to be given to that particular aspect.
Yep, no, 100%. And like ultimately, the strategy establishes the North Star, and then that is, where operations, process, workflow, and technology ultimately track. So it's a great point, especially in this day of age when, so many brands that, actually were just focused on revenue are now trying to, pivot and focus more around unit economics, profitability, and whatnot. So it is, fairly substantial change. And even if you think about the data required to optimize, again, I'll flip your example, revenue to profitability. Well, you need to understand your margins. You need to understand your expenses, your actual shipping costs, et cetera. And if that's not part of your data strategy, if that's not integrated into your workflow, if that's not part of how you can deploy a campaign, then you're gonna have to, there's gonna be a lot of work that has to go in a fishing expedition. To understand if you're featuring 3 products, what's the cost of the products, what the cost to ship the products, the weight of the products, where might people buy it from? Yes, there's a tremendous amount of detail there that can take something which intuitively seems pretty obvious, but operationally becomes a spider of complexity across a dozen teams and 58 processes, 58 steps.
Yes, totally agree. I mean, I think it's gotten a lot harder, especially in the last 6 months or 8 months or so, maybe where growth at all costs. It's being shunned at this point in time, but it's just a hard thing for executives to work on these days.
Great. So Pratik, we're about at the bottom of our time here. Final question for you. So if you were to have this conversation again with anyone in the technology, marketing space, really anywhere within that or beyond, who would that be and why?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I would think in terms of roles, I would think it's largely the CEO, CMO role, if you will, in that sense, to just kind of have a conversation about the importance. And then actually the teams, ultimately, at least in my past experience, unless you get the teams on board, the vision and across the different layers within the team, if you will, right from the ones who are leading it to the ones who are doing the work, and hopefully everyone's doing some work. So I don't know if I can kind of boil this question down to one individual or one role, but if I would probably start with the CX, so basically the CEO, CMO, and then basically take it down to the teams. That's where things get done. That's the only way to get things done.
Yep, no, it makes a ton of sense to me. I mean, and ultimately, as to my example a few minutes ago, the direction needs to be established at the top, and try to build a technology, an operational strategy around, a North Star, which isn't understood, is obviously going to be problematic. So starting there, makes a ton of sense to me. So closing out, here first, thank you, Pratik, for coming on to the podcast today, and sharing your wisdom with us. Really, when I reflect on the conversation we had today, it really comes down to several trends in the marketplace. The first of which that we've talked about in some of our previous episodes. The changing landscape around high-level business objectives and KPIs, and from there, really, just as per our conversation for the last 20 or 30 minutes, really just digging deep, into the operational complexities. What does it mean to optimize, for top line revenue, and what does it mean to optimize for profitability, and what are the differences between the two, and how does that actually, implement and execute, in all the operational processes across your enterprises with, lots of legacy technology, lots of legacy process, lots of folks who do things the way they do because that's how they've been doing them for the last 5, 10, 15 years and beyond. And so we like to, to look at things. Everything ultimately is an opportunity, no matter how dirty or messy or complex it might be. But certainly with sort of changing landscape of data, changing consumer expectations, changing budgets and beyond. I think there's no better opportunity than now, for everyone who's listening to the podcast to address some of these issues.
I agree. Yeah.
Great. And thank you to everyone listening to this episode of the Data Unlocked podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Simon Data, please visit us on the web at simondata.com or email us at hello@simondata.com.